Evening, everybody. Welcome to another live episode of The Breakdown. I'm your host, Nate Pike. It is March 29th, 2026. And God willing, we're going to keep it a little bit more on the... He says that at the beginning of every show, and then it always goes long. But we're going to stick to two topics tonight because there's two really big, really complex topics that have been percolating through the Alberta politics scene for the last little bit. And we need to talk about those things. So tonight, it's just two topics. Now, I'm going to put a spoiler warning. I'm just going to put a warning at the front end here because the first topic, you have nothing to worry about. Well, I mean, there's lots to worry about, but in regards to anything that is sensitive subject matter, the first topic, that'll be fine. The second topic, though, I got to throw all the trigger warnings on because we're going to be talking about MAID and we're going to be talking about suicide. And to be clear, those are two different things. But in order to unbullshit a lot of the things that the Premier of Alberta decided to bullshit out into the public sphere, we have to do some fact checking. And some of that fact checking does involve some pretty heavy subject matter, some pretty heavy facts. So wanted to put that up front. I'll try to remember to do a little bit of a thinger in advance because it's a lot. There's a lot. And it's a lot. But let's get started with the light stuff. Electoral boundaries. So this is so niche, but it's so important. And it's really easy for people to take a look at this and go, oh, hey, I don't see how this affects me, but I promise you it does. And by the time that we're done this segment, hopefully you'll be able to understand why what's going on right now, the pieces that are being laid out right now really should be giving everybody a lot of concern because boy, there's a lot going on. So to start with, we have to talk about, to begin with, why are we even talking about this? Well, by way of process, for lack of a better term, by way of process, the province of Alberta, it grows, it moves, it turns into different things every couple of years. And in order to make sure that people are being represented equally, that's very important for the rest of this topic. In order to make sure that people are being represented equally, there also has to be a balancing of things. So when one area of the province, one city, one municipality grows like crazy, and the other ones maybe they wither and die a little bit, you got to make sure that everybody's still getting representation. And it's not just about the numbers, it's also about the geography. Because there's certain places that have certain things that they share in common. And so every few years, I think the last time they put in a new boundary was 2019. So let's say 8 years. I don't know if that's accurate or not. The rest of what I'm going to say will be accurate. But let's say that every 8 years, the province puts together an electoral boundaries commission and they say, hey, Electoral Boundaries Commission, we would like you to take a look at where all of the people live and what all of the infrastructure is and what all of the natural delineating boundaries would be. And we would like you to redraw the electoral maps where appropriate. And sometimes they say, we're going to add some seats. So the Electoral Boundaries Commission was tasked a little while ago with not only putting together the new map, but also adding in 2 new seats. So the province of Alberta will be going from 87 MLAs to 89. And where do you put them? How do you make it all fit? How do you make it all make sense? So many questions, especially when there were some changes that were made at the very beginning of the commission. And to get a better sense of those changes, I'm gonna turn it over to this little guy right here. I don't know why, but for some reason, I'm just getting like mad Pinocchio vibes. I can't put my finger on it.
The existing act prior to the amendments requires a commission to consider the municipal boundaries when deciding its constituencies, its provincial constituencies. The new amendment would do away with that mandatory requirement and make a number of new factors permissive. One of those being that if the commission deems it appropriate to connect communities of interest, despite the fact that they don't share the same municipal boundary, for example, then that would be okay because those communities of interest are interconnected in other ways. And so that is not to presuppose what the commission might do, but there are certainly multiple areas all across this province that are very closely situated and connected to their major municipal urban centers.
Oh, so we're changing the criteria a little bit. We're changing it so that you don't have to necessarily be the same part of the same municipality. We can do things a little differently. We can change it up. We can get creative. Now, some people, when they heard Mickey Mraiche say that, immediately went, well, that doesn't sound so great. That sounds like it might be a problem. And it was only underscored when he was asked about it. And again, this is in a press conference like 2 years ago, when he was asked about it at that press conference in a follow-up question.
But it's not about drowning the urban progressive voters with rural voters, in your opinion?
Well, it's not just my opinion. I think that many jurisdictions are adopting this approach because it gives better representation, more effective representation. In fact, some of the wording in the amendments were taken directly out of the case law and the jurisprudence on electoral boundaries. This is something that we're trying to do to reflect what Alberta is moving towards, and that is the most innovative province in Canada, the best place to live, and certainly connected in multiple ways, not just by roadways, but via virtual means and otherwise. So no, I would say to you that other provinces, other jurisdictions have adopted this language. We've received the direction from our courts, both here and elsewhere, and the language that we're adopting is very consistent with language that is being recommended in both the jurisprudence and that has been adopted by various provinces all across Canada.
I love that answer. I love that answer for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, he starts by telling the truth. Is this about diluting the urban voters into rural to dilute the thing? Well, yes, absolutely it is. But also, we're doing all of these changes in order to be in line with the jurisprudence. And because of that, no, I said the wrong thing at the start. I will be a real boy one day. It's a fun answer. That whole press conference was a blast. There's a bunch of different clips that we could play from there. But we're not going to because we have so much to deal with tonight. But a lot of people listening to that and some of the commentary that came out was concerns that Mickey Mraiche was going to strong arm the Electoral Boundaries Commission to change the map sufficiently to break up the urban strongholds of progressives and do what they could to cement a conservative victory for the foreseeable future. They have something for this in the United States. It's called gerrymandering. And if you've ever paid any attention to some of the boundaries and how unbelievably ridiculous they get in the United States, it's absolutely bonkers. It's a good thing that Alberta doesn't have a history of emulating American policy, especially not under the Smith government. But before we get to that part, there was an interim report. This came in October of 2025, and this gave people a lot of, it was a bit of a sigh of relief for a lot of folks. Some folks, not so much. But for a lot of folks, it was a bit of a sigh of relief because the seats that were added, they weren't added rurally. They were added urbanly. There were some losers, though. So despite the fact that this report did not see the mad gerrymandering that many people were afraid of, there were some constituencies that got their boundaries moved, and then there were other constituencies that got straight up deleted, which brings us to Scott Sinclair. Because Mr. Sinclair, you may remember, in October of a while ago, no, it was May. It was a while ago. It was before this. It was in May. He got kicked out in May when they did the budget vote. I'm sorry. I had my papers confused for a second there. He got kicked out in May. And shortly thereafter, the interim commission report came out and they were like, yeah, and we're getting rid of Scott Sinclair's constituency. And Scott Sinclair said, oh, I don't like that. there's the graphic I was looking for. So yes, it was in May of 2025, March of 2025, that he left the UCP party for not voting on the budget. And he said that the reason that he didn't was because he didn't see enough reflection for Northern Alberta, enough supports, enough commitments in the budget for Northern Alberta, so he couldn't in good conscience support the budget. And then he got kicked out of the party for not supporting the budget. And so he's been kind of on his own. Now, it's been an interesting ride for Mr. Sinclair because he got kicked out of the UCP. His constituency was erased, and then he started something of a campaign, if you will, to improve his effectiveness in the legislature. And there's some interesting things that on a quick look come up with that, because let's remember, Scott Sinclair was kicked out of the UCP for not voting for the budget of the UCP in 2025. He sits as an independent right now. Hey, we just had a budget. I wonder how he voted there. Oh, that's right. Scott Sinclair voted for the provincial budget that just passed. He's right there in the third column, fifth from the top. But he's also had, since kind of getting quiet, since not joining the Alberta Party, as many people kind of hoped that he would, he's had a few other little victories that are worth probably paying some attention to. The first one is he's had two particular motions. He had a motion 507 that had to do with energy stuffs. And with a government that has demonstrated time and time again that it absolutely will not support any motions, things, and stuffs that aren't theirs. And we're going to talk more about that as well in just a little bit. With that government, somehow Scott Sinclair managed to get his motion passed. Not only that, but with the return of the final report, he got the word that the riding of Lesser Slave Lake has been saved. So he's kind of having a good little run there. Things are getting a little bit better. But there's another thing that's kind of jumped out. Scott Sinclair doesn't post a whole lot on social media, but he does post some things. And when he does post, it can be very, very interesting because you might remember a little while ago, the UCP ran out this whole thing about how Don Cherry should be appointed the Order of Canada. The very definition of bread and circuses, if you ask me. But if you ask Scott Sinclair, he was very, very adamant that, in fact, absolutely, Don Cherry should be given the Order of Canada. Now, Don Cherry's a controversial figure. There's nothing to take away from that, and he's had some moments where he said some things for sure that are deeply problematic, for sure. But it's fascinating, and this is the interesting part. It's fascinating that Scott Sinclair decided to pick up the UCP talking points around the same time that he voted for the UCP budget, and around the same time as the Electoral Boundaries Commission, in conjunction and in response to a bunch of other MLAs from Northern Alberta, of whom I cannot think of any who might be NDP, lobbied to say, no, we should save this constituency. We should save it. And that brings us to March. Wait, it's March right now, because we got the final report, kind of. And this is where the process gets a little bit wonky, a little bit important to understand. Because what happens now, in a perfect world, is the final report goes out and they say, hey, Legislative Assembly, here is our final report. We would like it very much if you could please vote and affirm it. And then this is how we'll have the next election. These will be the new boundaries for the next election. And in the legislature, more often than not, although there are periods in history where the legislatures have said, yeah, cute report, we're going to draw our own lines. We like to color. More often than not, the recommendations are accepted. But we've got us a curveball, because It turns out Albertans didn't just get one report. Albertans got two. And this is where it gets really wild. There was a supplemental, I guess, I don't know what to call it, a minority report that was included in the majority report. So they've got all the people with the commission, and they got together and they did all of their consultations. And then in January, they said, okay, let's draw some maps. And most of the commission went and drew maps. And two other members of the commission went to play with their own set of crayons and came up with a different set of maps, all of which are included in this final report. But what's bonkers is the majority members of the commission called out inside of the report. So it's a report on the minority report that's in the report. It's very meta. They called out the minority report, and we're going to take a couple minutes to go through that, because it's not just we had some disagreements. We thought that the line should be a little bit over here, and they thought the line should be a little bit over there, and so we have two maps with two slightly different lines. It is night and day difference in the maps that were produced between the majority report and the minority report. So we got to spend a little bit of time on this to start with. From the majority report response to the minority report, in October of 2025, the commission submitted a unanimous report to the Speaker of the Legislature. From then until January 2026, when all public hearings and written submissions had been received, the commission focused on fine-tuning and amending our interim report. Our goal was to do the best we could to create a map of 89 electoral divisions that was in line with the Act, was constitutional based, on the tools available to us, and provided effective representation for Albertans. In late January, the minority departed substantially from that goal. We are of the view that the minority's proposed maps violate the principle of procedural fairness, unreasonably apply the statutory considerations, and likely violate Section 3 of the Charter. Each of these concerns is outlined in more detail below. First, the minority's approach violates the principles of procedural fairness and, relatedly, the values underlying Section 3 of the Charter. The interim report was unanimous. The about face by the minority did not give the public any notice of what the minority proposes. We wish to highlight but a few of the most egregious examples. So let's be really, really clear what's going on here, because this is absolutely bonkers. They all got together and unanimously voted on the maps, which are by and large the same as to what we got in the final report, with the exception of Scott Sinclair got his writing back, constituency back. But at the end of January, mysteriously, at the end of January 2026, the Boundary Commission, they got two guys who went off and said, yeah, we agreed with you, but we're going to go do our own thing for mysterious reasons that are never articulated clearly anywhere. And the remaining commission said, that's not how this is supposed to work. Wait, you're actually going to do this? Okay, well, now we have to include a chapter saying how bad this is. That's what's going on here. Let's go to the next one. First, the minority's approach violates the principles of procedural fairness and, relatedly, the values underlying Section 3 of the Charter. The interim report was unanimous. I say this like 5 or 6 times. The about face by the minority did not give the public any notice of what the minority proposes. We wish to highlight but a few of the most egregious examples. To begin, their changes to Red Deer, Cochrane, and Chestermere are the product of absolutely no public input or engagement. Moreover, in the cases of Airdrie and St. Albert, there was no public input or engagement from the radically different approach to hybrid electoral boundaries taken by the minority as compared to the interim report. The commission received no public support whatsoever for the minority's maps of these cities, nor are they necessary to make any other changes that do have public support. This is a clear infringement of the basic rules of fairness and due process involving people in those communities. Further, it goes contrary to the underlying values behind Section 3. Again, a little bit more context. This commission, they traveled the province for a while. They did, and they talked to people in all of the different communities, and they said, "What do you think in constituency 5? What would you like your boundaries to be?" And that gave the public, those what decided to show up, the opportunity to say, well, here's what I think. And this is why I think this would be good. And this is why I think your suggestions are terrible. Please don't do that. So there is public engagement that's supposed to happen. And as part of this process, that's the whole role of the commission, taking nigh but 2 years. I'm channeling my inner David Shepard there. Nigh but 2 years to work on this whole report. So they could talk to people. If they just wanted to draw the lines the way they just wanted to draw them, they wouldn't need the commission or to pay the people in the commission. So there's that. But it gets even more bonkers. Second, the minority's reasons are substantially unreasonable. I love that sentence so much. They justify hybrids in principle, the matter the majority agrees with, as a means to ensure effective representation of rural areas without taking away urban seats to do so. This principle would mean that if a rural electoral division must be consolidated due to low populations, hybrid electoral divisions could be created, for example, around Lethbridge, to ensure that rural electoral divisions do not become unnecessarily large. However, they improperly use hybrid electoral divisions to do the opposite. They retain every rural electoral division from 2017 while also hybridizing Calgary, Red Deer, Airdrie, Cochrane, Chestermere, and Lethbridge, leading to an additional rural representation at the expense of urban residents. I just got to say this again, how bonkers this is. This is the commission saying this other report that we have to include because these two folks said they wanted to draw their own pictures. It's so bad, it disproportionately favors rural and it punishes urban. Hey, that sounds vaguely familiar. I can't imagine why, but it's still the gerrymandering joke that I made. I almost have to say that I didn't write that myself, because this is the next passage we need to highlight. Building on the problems outlined above, we note that the minority report seems to be motivated by other considerations. To put it starkly, 15 electoral divisions, mostly in central and northeast Calgary, are approximately 11% above the average provincial population. By contrast, 14 electoral divisions, mostly in the south and west of Calgary, have an average variance of just 2% above the provincial average. What might be the minority's true motivation for this? Question mark. And I'm reading this next line verbatim. Our friends south of the border may have a term for this type of redistricting. So the majority report is saying unequivocally, the minority report that's part of the whole report, it's towards the end, you got to scroll down a whole bunch, is gerrymandering. They're trying to fix the boundaries in order to make sure that certain people do very well in the next provincial election. They don't use the term gerrymandering, but again, our friends south of the border may have a term for this type of redistricting, as well as calling into question the minority's true motivation. This is in an official government report. That's how bad the wheels came off. And the maps are nuts. We're going to take a look at them, but we have to read this section about the map first. The maps proposed by the minority are anything but clear and understandable. As an example, Calgary Foothills Airdrie West and Calgary Nolan Hill Cochrane look strange with bits and pieces of various municipalities and rural areas patched together without rhyme or reason. These two electoral divisions are adjacent to each other, and there is no excuse for not having clear boundaries that incorporate communities of interest. Why would a resident of Nolan Hill in Calgary be included in a hybrid electoral division with Cochrane, while neighborhoods to their west, such as Rocky Ridge or Tuscany, which are closer to Cochrane and along the same highway, are included in a mostly urban Calgary electoral division? I mean, it's a perfectly valid question. Why are you drawing these big squiggly lines? But how bad is it? Let's take a look. So this map here And for those of you that are watching, this is very much, for those of you that are listening, this section is very much a visual piece. So I apologize if you're listening to the podcast version. But this section here is the map that the majority has put forward. This is the map they've recommended. For those of you that are watching, I call your attention to that big green chunk. That's Calgary, Glenmore, Tsuut'ina. And the reason why I'm calling your attention is to get an idea of how big of a scale change we're talking about for the city of Calgary and the constituencies that would represent the city of Calgary. Look at how much smaller it gets when you have to include all of the new constituencies. It's absolutely bonkers. It's like 2 times, 3 times the size in the first one. And the second one is much different. It's nuts. That's what they're proposing. This is what the Minority Report proposes. So, to be very, very clear, looking at those pictures, it's pretty easy to see that what we're looking at with the boundary redrawing as suggested by the Minority Report out of the blue in January of this year is very much gerrymandering. It's very, very much gerrymandering. It's absolutely diluting the progressive urban voter with the conservative rural vote, which are generalizations that I'm not personally a huge fan of, but what are you going to do? That's absolutely what's happening. Let's take a look at Edmonton. What happens in Edmonton? Well, there's Edmonton. Oh, look, there's another gray square that we can use for size and context. So that is the map that's been proposed by the Commission for Edmonton. What happens when we add in the Minority Report one? Well, we had to rotate the page. We had to rotate the page to fit the new map because that's how wide it gets. And you'll see that the city of Edmonton, the constituencies for the city of Edmonton now blow way past that gray square right there. And it doesn't stop there. Because if we take a look at what it does to the other cities across the province, it absolutely is doing the same let's divide and conquer approach, particularly with Red Deer and Lethbridge. St. Albert gets carved up even more. Airdrie gets carved up into multiple different constituencies. So there's no doubt any reasonable person could look at this report, the Minority Report, and go, wow, this is really something. This really looks like gerrymandering. It really looks like they're trying to tilt the odds in the favor of the House in order to make sure that the UCP or whatever they go by the time we get to the next election, they win the next election. It very much looks like that. And the wild part is, again, this is something that back in 2 years ago, Mickey Amey articulated that he wanted to see this. So to revisit the timeline, Mickey Amey said, this is what I would like to see. He then set forth the Electoral Boundaries Commission, who in their interim report appear to have done very good, reasonable work with a lot of math. It didn't give Mickey Amey what he wanted. So at the end of January, 2 of these members all of a sudden disappear, come up with their own set of maps that gives Mickey Amey exactly what he wants. And the $50,000 question that everybody should be asking themselves, looking at this, is do you honestly believe that the UCP are going to take a look at the Majority Report that says, yeah, we didn't give you those rural seats that you wanted, and we're not going to redraw the municipal maps to tilt the odds in your favor, but this is very evidence-based, and it is fair, and it follows all the rules, and there won't be any constitutional challenges, so you should please do this one? Or will the UCP look at it and go, oh, good, you two guys gave us what we asked for, and now we're going to take it? I mean, I know where my money is. The only variable that I have up for grabs in all of this is how does Scott Sinclair vote? And is he still sitting independent when he does? It'll be interesting to see. If any of this is alarming to you, you should read the report. You should take a look at all the maps. You should take a look at all the little constituencies, because some constituencies are going to get some pretty big changes one way or the other. Other constituencies are going to stay largely the same. But the minority report, to go back to that Calgary map, because it's so bonkers, the minority report gives a lot of conservative MLAs, especially certain ministers of education, the redistricting that they're looking for, and that they actually sent letters to advocate for. I wonder how he'll vote. Not really. Write your MLAs. And most importantly, and this is the thing that I would really emphasize, for anybody who doesn't believe in gaming the system, I don't care if you're conservative or progressive. This is dirty politics. If you don't support dirty politics, you should be writing your MLA, whether they're NDP or whether they're UCP. And you should be saying, regardless of where you are in the province, you should be saying, hey, this is not cool, man. I don't appreciate what this is. Is this who you are? Because they're going to be voting on it. And I would also encourage everybody who's listening to this or watching this, take a look at the report, take a look at the maps, take a look at the constituencies that you live in, because you might be very, very surprised at just exactly how much it's being split up. The constituency that I live in is going to change massively either way in some very unexpected ways, depending on how the UCP vote. I live in Calgary. I could be voting with Airdrie. Yep. So we'll see how that goes. Moving on from there. And this is where I got to I'm going to reiterate the warning. Because I wish there was some way I could make this next section a little bit funny, but I don't think there is. And I don't want to treat it with any kind of disrespect because of the weight of it all. Because we're going to talk about MAID, and that's a big conversation on its own. On its own, it's a big conversation. When you have idiot. Maybe not an idiot. Let's not call the premier an idiot. When you have someone who's behaving like an idiot leading the conversation, that's where it gets even more complicated and even more fraught. And so we're going to try to untangle some of that tonight. But we are going to be talking about MAID. We are going to be talking about mental health stuffs. We are going to be talking about suicide stuffs. So if any of that is distressing for you, tap out now or hang out for as long as you want and tap out later. But I just don't want anyone to be surprised by where we're going to go tonight, even though some of this is, I'm not going to lie. I was in putting together tonight's show. There was a point where I was like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me that we're doing this? Because some of this is just so egregious. I want to put all my cards on the table as well before we get into this conversation. I've seen both sides of this coin in a lot of different ways. I grew up in a profoundly religious household where these sorts of topics were very much decided upon in the same realm as, like, I grew up, abortion's bad. And then I learned some things. And there was a really amazing priest who had some really amazing views that expanded my perception on it a little bit. That was very, very helpful for me. The MAID thing, the euthanasia, as we used to call it in the 90s, that was all life is sacred. All life is sacred. You need every second that you can squeeze out of it. That was the idea that I grew up with. I have moved past that in many different ways. One of the biggest reasons why, and we're going to do a little story time with Nate here real quick. I'm a paramedic. And you ask paramedics, hey, what's that? What's the call that you remember most? And usually that's an invitation to nightmare fuel. But one of the calls that I experienced that really redefined my worldview on the topic of MAID or euthanasia or whatever we want to call it was very, very early in my career. And I will never, ever, ever forget this call. And it wasn't even a merge call. It was a stupid transfer. And it was to pick up a lady who had horrifying cancer. It had metastasized to pretty much every part of her body. She was in so much pain that she was in effect kept in a medically induced coma. At that point in time, there were no mechanisms for any sort of MAID or medical assistance in dying for her. The only pathway that the family had was to discontinue the feeding tube and wait for her to just give out whilst being kept in a medically induced coma. And transporting her really changed my perspective because her outcome was inevitable. And the best that we could do as a society with all of the medicine that we can throw at things was to just keep her in a coma and starve her to death. That's horrifying. And that really, really changed my perspective. And my perspectives continued to grow and evolve over that period of time. So there's my biases right up front. I have zero issues with a properly run, well-protected, safeguards in place, MAID program in Canada. I have no issue with it whatsoever. There's my biases. Let's get into it. So in order to get into it, we have to talk a little bit about the history of MAID and euthanasia, if you will, in Canada. But before we do that, there's one thing that I want to be really, really clear about. And this is important because MAID is, again, medical assistance in dying. It is part of the medical continuum of care. If you think about a person's life journey, they're born, they're receiving medical care of some kind right out of the gates. It stands to reason that that medical care that's doing everything they can to ensure that that person has the best possible experience continues right up until they take their last breath. That's just a reasonable argument to make, I think. It's very important to distinguish what MAID is from suicide. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but I'm going to let the good folks at the Center for Suicide Prevention do the argument for me. So, what is the difference between suicide and medical assistance in dying in Canada? For suicide, people thinking about suicide do not actually want to die. They want the pain of living to end. And that's an important distinction. Often carried alone and in secrecy, leaving loved ones with devastating grief, often violent and carried out by people who do not enter or are misunderstood by the medical system. With appropriate support and care, recovery is possible. So that's suicide. MAID, and this is again defined by the Center for Suicide Prevention, hastens death for people in irremediable, I should have practiced saying that before the show, circumstances. Involves decision-making by medical personnel and the option to involve loved ones. Non-violent medical intervention, increased palliative care can help ease the suffering of dying. So they're two different things. And that's really, really important context to try to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this. If we're going to talk about the conversation around MAID in Canada, it really does in many ways from the larger public perspective start with Sue Rodriguez. Sue Rodriguez was diagnosed with ALS, and she lost her case in front of the Supreme Court in Canada by a split decision of 5-4. Nonetheless, she took her own life with the help of an anonymous doctor on February 12th, 1994. But this sparked a national conversation. And there are lots of anecdotal stories about Sue Rodriguez after having lost, being applauded in restaurants for the bravery that she showed in trying to move the country and the practice of medicine forward to include care around death and dying. That brings us to these three ladies. So in April of 2011, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association filed a lawsuit with family members of Kay Carter, who's the lady in the middle, and two women named Gloria Taylor and Elaine Chapray. That decision ultimately led to a ruling in 2015 that saw the courts mandate that the criminal code would have to be changed to reflect the violations of the charter that were made, that were at the time determined to be in effect by banning MAID. So, to be clear, in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled on Carter v. Canada, and the Supreme Court said, there's some charter violations that are happening here. Again, that was a unanimous decision. You have to amend the criminal code so the doctors can do the doctoring, even around the things that are uncomfortable, even around the things that maybe people have some uncomfortable thoughts around. You have to amend the criminal code. So in 2016, the federal government made some changes. A lot of people felt like those changes were rushed, and a lot of people felt like they were insufficient. So in 2019, on September 11th, the Superior Court of Quebec, in its Truchon v. Canada decision, declared unconstitutional the reasonable foreseeability of natural death eligibility criterion contained in the federal MAID legislation and the end-of-life eligibility criterion contained in Quebec's Act respecting end-of-life care. So up until that point, the rules were you had to have reasonable foreseeability of natural death if you wanted to access MAID, and that you had to be at the end of your life. Determining reasonably. The Superior Court of Quebec declared that unconstitutional. So you have the Superior Court, which is basically the Quebec Supreme Court, saying, yeah, you know what? You guys have to go a little bit farther with this because you are you're violating the Constitution with the way that these rules are. You cannot arbitrarily say XYZ. On October 5th, 2020, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General Canada introduced former Bill C-7, an act to amend the criminal code, which brought about the medical assistance in dying. Now, from the Government of Canada website that details the eligibility, this is really important, especially for the conversation that we're going to get into. The revised 2021 law modified MAID eligibility criteria in response to the Superior Court of Quebec's 2019 Truchon decision. The law no longer requires a person's natural death to be reasonably foreseeable as an eligibility criterion for MAID. As of March 17th, 2021, persons who wish to receive MAID must meet the following eligibility criteria. And to be clear, this is what I'm about to read off here. This would be considered track one of MAID. They have to be 18 years of age or older and have decision-making capacity, be eligible for publicly funded healthcare services, make a voluntary request that is not the result of external pressure, give informed consent to receive MAID, meaning that the person has consented to receiving MAID after they have received all information needed to make this decision, have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. This excludes a mental illness until March 17th of 2027. Be an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, have enduring and intolerable physical or psychological suffering that cannot be alleviated under conditions the person considers acceptable. There's some pretty big criteria there. But I want to highlight the last one, because one of the pieces that's very, very difficult to navigate in this conversation is respecting each individual's autonomy. There's a lot of people, and I include myself in this, back when I was thumping on Bibles. It was not about respecting other people's autonomy. It was not about looking life through their lens. It was entirely about, I thought I should have that control. I thought I should be able to say, no, you don't get to do that. And that's a very, very easy trap to fall into. And the trap gets even easier to fall into the closer that you get to the people. The more that you move away from a hypothetical discussion into a real world discussion where we're maybe talking about family members who are looking at MAID, the harder it is to remember to keep their autonomy and their choices at the forefront of the decision-making matrix. So that was the track one. That's for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable. There is also track two. Safeguards for persons whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. The following procedural safeguards apply to persons whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. Request for MAID must be made in writing. A written request must be signed by one independent witness. A paid professional, personal, or healthcare worker can be an independent witness. 2 independent doctors or nurse practitioners must provide an assessment and confirm that all of the eligibility requirements are met. If neither of the 2 practitioners who assess eligibility has experience or expertise in the medical condition that is causing the person's suffering, they must consult with a practitioner who has such expertise. The person must be informed that they can withdraw their request at any time in any manner. The person must be informed of available and appropriate means to relieve their suffering, including counseling services, mental health and disability support services, community services, and palliative care, and must be offered consultations with professionals who provide those services. The person and the practitioners must have discussed reasonable and available means to relieve the person's suffering and agree that the person has seriously considered those means. The eligibility assessments must take at least 90 days. But this period can be shortened if the person is about to lose the capacity to make healthcare decisions, as long as both assessments have been completed. Immediately before MAID is provided, the practitioner must give the person an opportunity to withdraw their request and ensure that they give their express consent. So, if somebody is not immediately going to die, it's not foreseeable, but they have a diagnosed condition that will result in their death. That's the track 2 piece. Those are all the criteria. Now, there is another piece of the conversation that we have to talk about, and that's advanced requests. And the idea behind an advanced requests is, what if I really don't want to have to live with a disease that is going to catastrophically affect my quality of life, and it's going to rob me of my capacity. The regular example that gets used is dementia or Alzheimer's. And it's worth noting that the Alzheimer's Society of Canada supports advance requests. So, to be clear, an advance request is a request for MAID made by an individual who still has the capacity to make decisions before they are eligible or want to receive it. The intent is that MAID be provided in the future after they have lost the capacity to consent and when certain conditions that they specify in their requests are met. Right now in Canada, the provision of MAID based on an advanced request is not allowed, but the government of Canada recognizes and has recognized that's something that needs to be part of the conversation. And we need to figure out how we're going to handle that piece. To that end, they put together a national conversation on advance requests for medical assistance in dying, and they collected some data. And it's important to talk about that data. What is the support like? Well, it turns out it's pretty overwhelming, because when we take a look at what the supports actually look like, 66.9% agree with the statement. Support for advance requests for people with an incurable medical condition that will lead to loss of decision-making capacity. 66.9% of people agree that there should be that option available for folks. Now, there's 11.8 that are like, whatever. Only 16.6%, 16.6% of people who were part of this this consultation disagree with it. The next question, support for advance requests for people with an incurable medical condition that could lead to sudden or unexpected loss of decision-making capacity. 58.3% agree with it. 17.5% are neutral, and 18.9% disagree. So the difference there is the majority agree, the 66.9% agree that if somebody is diagnosed with a condition that will lead to, the smaller numbers, the 58.3, is that could lead to. So again, there's some nuance there. Which brings us to the announcement that came from the province on March 18th, 2026.
Alberta believes that patient safety is and must always be our first concern. And our government has been highly skeptical of federal moves to widen eligibility to those whose only medical condition is mental illness. This possibility was first announced in 2023, and we've been studying the issue carefully to ensure that we're acting in the best interest of Albertans. If federal eligibility is extended to include mental illness, like we expect it to be in 2027, there is a serious risk that vulnerable individuals living with a mental illness may choose this most final of actions when other treatment options are available to them. In other words, for individuals whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, there are often other care and treatment options available. Mental health and wellness are things many people manage throughout their entire lives, and periods of severe illness can feel dark, hopeless, and overwhelming. But with the right support, many people regain stability and go on to live full and meaningful lives. MAID should not become a permanent response to a moment of crisis or despair that can change with care and time.
Now, there's a lot going on in that clip from Danny there. And as you'll see as we go through clips from Danny tonight, there's some pretty significant fact-checking and reframing that we have to do. One of the first things that's going on there, and this is something that the UCP are very, very, very good at, is they trot out a vulnerable group. They pick somebody who is a member of the group that could be conceivably impacted by their policies, and they go, you see, we have to protect them. That's who we have to protect. The notion that somebody who is experiencing an intermittent, that's what she talked about, periods of crisis, you're having a bad day. We don't want anyone making decisions based on a bad day. The notion that two medical professionals, be it physicians or nurse practitioners, would look at somebody who's experiencing an episodic crisis and go, yeah, no, I think this is made appropriate, casts some pretty big aspersions on the people who would be making those assessments and making those decisions. And again, I refer you back to the reality that right now, if you're not somebody who's familiar with the conditions that that person is experiencing, you have to talk to somebody who is. So Danny's already framing this as if we don't do this, my God, all of the safeguards that are in place, they would just disappear and so many people would be at risk. And it just doesn't, there's no evidence whatsoever to support that. And the bill does a whole lot more than that, as little Mickey Amory said himself.
Bill 18, the Safeguards for Last Resort Termination of Life Act, will address obvious gaps in the current federal system, and it will set strong, consistent standards to better protect vulnerable Albertans. At its core, Bill 18 places important eligibility limits on MAID in Alberta. MAID will be prohibited for those whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. It's also known as Track 2 MAID. MAID should never be a substitute for other healthcare options or services. Advanced requests for MAID raise serious ethical and practical concerns. That is why under Bill 18, advanced requests will not be permitted, along with MAID for individuals without capacity to make their own healthcare decisions. Physicians and nurse practitioners will also be prohibited from making referrals for individuals to receive MAID outside of Alberta. Given the seriousness and the finality of MAID, Alberta's legislation will require assessors and providers to meet training and educational requirements. And that's why I'll also be introducing mandatory sanctions when a regulatory college finds that a physician has violated Alberta's MAID legislation. To reduce any coercion and to ensure MAID decisions are initiated and driven by patients, physicians will be restricted from giving MAID information to their patients when they are providing other health services to them, unless the patient brings it up. The public display of MAID information, such as posters, will also be restricted within healthcare facilities. Finally, Bill 18 will make it clear that physicians have the right to refuse to conduct MAID assessments or to provide MAID, and that healthcare facilities will have the right to refuse to allow MAID services on their premises. Along with this, an exclusion zone of 150 meters around a healthcare facility will provide a sense of safety for people facing serious health challenges, along with vulnerable palliative care patients who don't wish to be exposed to MAID.
So, Danny says this is all just about making sure that we're protecting vulnerable Albertans. Mickey Amory steps up to the mic and says this is all just to make sure that we're protecting vulnerable Albertans. And then we get into the nuts and bolts of what's actually going on here, because we start with Alberta is just going to straight up outright ban Track 2. So while that is allowed, while it is legal, Alberta is just going to ban Track 2. That's the people who have the condition, but they have no reasonable expectation of death within the next 12 months. So if you're interminably suffering, but you can't find somebody to say, oh yeah, within the next 12 months, you'll be gone. There's no options for you. There will be no advance requests. Now, again, I want to be very, very clear because we're going to see some clever little wordplay from Danny as we go. Right now, in Canada, advance requests aren't legal. The federal government is very, very clearly doing consultation and has received advice that they need to come up with a pathway or a program to make sure that we can have the advanced requests, but boy, we got to have some really, really good safeguards in there as well to make sure that nothing untoward happens. But then it goes a step farther, because now we also will not, no healthcare practitioner will be able to do a referral outside of Alberta. So if you do have a patient, if you're a physician and you do have a patient who said, hey, I just can't take this anymore. I can't move. I have no quality of life. I'm in pain always, but I don't have a reasonable expectation of death. Can you help me out? Find me a physician who will talk to me, who isn't under the ideological laws of the UCP. That healthcare practitioner cannot say, okay, I'll hook you up with a guy in Manitoba or in, I don't know, Saskatchewan. Feels like Saskatchewan's probably going to be on the same track if they aren't already. I don't follow their politics. Or BC. And we'll see why that fits in a second. They can't give any MAID info unless asked. Where it gets to be really obvious, though, is the buffer zones. Not allowed to have any information. We don't want people to be informed that this is an option. And we want to have 150 meter buffer zones where people can't go and talk about MAID. And we're also going to make it so that healthcare facilities that don't want to provide MAID services, even if appropriate, even if it meets all of the new stringent criteria that the UCP have put into place, we're not going to make any hospitals have to provide that service. Gosh, I can't imagine what kind of hospitals would refuse to provide a service. That wouldn't happen to be, I don't know, religious hospitals. Maybe that would be it. It would be. Maybe there's been lots of stories already about people in Alberta having to wait in the cold for a bus so that they could go somewhere to get their assessment because the facility that they were living in, be it a long-term care facility or a hospital, refused to provide them the services, refused to even let people come into the hospital. to provide those services, not as hospital employees, to provide those consultations. Yeah, it's already happened. So we're talking about religious hospitals. We're not talking, at this point, we're no longer talking about evidence-based medicine. We're talking about pure ideology, and that's it. And that's where we get to the last part, the conscience rights part. Nobody, I am not aware of a single case, and I am open to correction on this, where somebody who did not believe, want to be involved with the application or the administration of MAID was forced to do so against their will. I'm just not aware of that. That is a bullshit conscience rights dog whistle, and it is a very, very slippery slope from that to reproductive health care. And that's one of the reasons why this conversation is so important. Because if you think that this conversation that's happening in the province of Alberta right now about MAID is a isolated incident, I'm very, very sorry, but I do not for 1 second believe that it is. And we got all of the greatest hits from Danny as well. Because whose fault is all of this? Well, it's the feds.
Under federal policy, eligibility is widening, while the guardrails and oversight are weakening. The way Alberta sees it, these escalating factors put the safety and well-being of vulnerable individuals at far too grave a risk. So our government is acting now before the federal government weakens the guardrails any further. We believe MAID must be a compassionate option reserved only for those who will not recover from terminal illness. That's why, as part of our spring legislative session, we'll be introducing the Safeguards for Last Resort Termination of Life Act. If passed, it will make sure that here in Alberta, medical assistance in dying has robust and appropriate safeguards in place. It will limit MAID eligibility to circumstances where natural death is reasonably foreseeable and recovery is not. It will prohibit MAID in Alberta for those under age 18 and for those whose sole condition is a mental illness. It will set out clear regulations for how Alberta provides MAID, and it will provide much-needed clarity for patients, families, and healthcare providers alike. Ultimately, this is about protecting vulnerable Albertans and establishing strong safeguards for a healthcare practice of great consequence and finality.
See, so it's the feds' fault. The feds are changing the rules. They're changing the guardrails because the courts told them that they had to. Because the courts told them that they had violated the Constitution. The courts said, hey, government, I see what you're trying to do there, but there's these things called rights, and they do, in fact, matter a bunch. And so we would like very much if you could please make sure that your laws are in line with the constitutional requirements that laws are supposed to be subject to. But that's not the way that the Danny framed it at all. The way that Danny's framing it is, oh, this is the feds and they're doing that thing that they do where they're taking the irony of Danielle Smith being the one to say we have to protect the guardrails of our institutions. I can't even with that. It is so just so completely over the top. I don't even know what to do with it. But she gets up there and she sure does it. And then she tries to back it up with some numbers. And we got to take some time on those too.
Since 2021, total MAID deaths in Alberta have risen from 594 in 2021 to 1,242 in 2025, an increase of 109%. And even though rates are lower in Alberta than the national average, MAID is now one of the leading causes of death in Canada. In just the 10 years it's been legal in Canada, the rate of MAID in our country has come to exceed that of other jurisdictions where it's been legal for far longer. Across the country, total MAID deaths have risen from 10,066 in 2021 to 16,499 in 2024, an increase of 64%. Given the permanence of the decision, these trends should give anyone pause.
It's just so Gross. It's so gross. MAID, leading cause of death. No, it's not. It's not. And MAID is not something that should ever be considered the cause of death, because the criteria are so stringent for who can get into MAID, who can access the program, especially under track 1, but also under track 2. The notion that MAID is a cause of death is willfully ignorant. And it is flagrantly harmful language. And you don't need to take it from me, because the World Health Organization says so as well. It is important to note, this is from the federal government's own numbers on MAID statistics. It is important to note that because MAID is not considered a cause of death by the World Health Organization, the number of MAID provisions should not be compared to cause of death statistics in Canada to assess prevalence of MAID or to rank MAID as a cause of death, as stated by the World Health Organization. A cause of death is the disease or injury that initiated the train of events leading directly to death, or the circumstances of the accident or violence which produced the fatal injury. MAID by contrast is a health service provided as part of end of life or complex care, which a person can access in very limited circumstances. For example, if a person suffering from advanced cancer chooses to receive MAID to alleviate their suffering at the end of life, the cause of death extracted from their death certificate for the purposes of vital statistics will be cancer. And let's take a look at what the actual Canadian numbers are. Because when you take a look at, and there's often some overlap, so the stats get a little bit weird, but when you take a look at what are the actual rates of the diseases that are causing people to select MAID as a treatment for that disease, which is their cause of death, not the MAID, as of, from the 4th Annual Report on Medical Assistance in Dying in Canada, an average of 63% was from cancer. 18.8% was cardiovascular, 14.9% were other conditions, 13.2% were respiratory, 12.6% were neurological, 10.1% were multiple comorbidities, and 8.2% were organ failure. That was from 2022. For 2023, numbers pretty much the same. Cancer, 61%, with 9,435 cases. There are 2,416 cases of cardiovascular conditions out of a total of 15,343 cases. MAID doesn't cause death. All of the other things that have driven a person to seek MAID cause death. MAID is the management of how that death happens, period. But we still aren't done with Danny's bullshit, because she had some stories that she wanted to share.
Do you not trust that Albertans and practitioners can make the right decision for themselves?
Well, I'm watching as the international community is looking at what's happening in Alberta, and I would just, encourage you to look at some of the stories that have been written in The Spectator and The Guardian, where they're pretty appalled that those who are living in poverty, those whose only circumstances seem to be managing mental challenges of dealing with a chronic condition, are being advised that MAID's an option. And when we see that kind of international criticism saying this is really outside the norm, we have to take that seriously. I think, as the doctor said, that is certainly not all practitioners who are doing that. But when we read stories about a young man repeatedly refused MAID for his mental health condition in Ontario, able to fly across the country to BC and find an amenable doctor for it, we're concerned about that. When we hear of Veterans Affairs officials counseling and encouraging people with PTSD to consider MAID, these are things we want to stop. We don't want anyone to be counseled to end their life prematurely if they do not have a terminal illness. And if we have to make that clear in law, we'll make it clear in law. And I think it's because of those stories that we keep reading about that we think it is time for government to act.
It's because of those stories that we keep reading about that we think it's time to act. I'm going to throw this out here. I don't feel like it's the first time. I'm certain it won't be the last. But if we could please have major policy decisions that have massive ramifications not be made by what Danny saw on her Facebook, that would be great, please. Because to no surprise, it turns out both of those circumstances she grossly misrepresents and are way more complicated. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about the veterans. There's been no shortage of reporting from a variety of sources where, oh my gosh, did you hear about the veterans who are going in to get their PTSD dealt with? And to be clear, PTSD is a recoverable condition. Hi, I have some firsthand experience with this. But there were concerns that there were a few veterans that had been, to some degree, counseled into considering MAID for their mental health stuffs, which again is not currently legal in Canada. You can't get it. You can't. It's not legal for purely mental health things. So right out of the gates, that should set off the average person's bullshit detector. That should give pause to say, oh, we don't know about that because it's not even illegal. So how would that even work? I have some questions. And it turns out if you were one of those people who said, I have some questions, you weren't alone, because as the federal government also had questions. The military, they had questions too. They did a whole investigation into what the heck is going on here. This is not what's supposed to happen. So it's important to realize that you can have people, again, to be clear, if somebody was telling somebody that you should get MAID for purely your mental health stuff, that's not legal in Canada. It certainly wasn't legal in Canada in, let me just double check the date of when this story broke, right, 2022. So it certainly wasn't legal in Canada in 2022. It's not legal now. So right out of the gates, that seems weird. But it also means nobody would be able to get MAID if their only diagnosis was PTSD, as Danny seemed to represent there. First thing. Second thing, what was the extent of the problem? How big of a problem are we talking about? Because this person is clearly acting not in accordance with all of the rules that are supposed to exist for MAID. This is somebody who is, in effect, presumably breaking the law. That's not a function of MAID. That's a function of that person. Hey, what did that investigation find? Well, it turns out that in November of 2022, the department became aware of 2 more veterans with whom the same employee. Oh, we're talking about one person. In the meantime, the department reviewed all 402,000 files in its client databases dating back to June 2016, when MAID legislation came into effect. The search and analysis did not uncover any incidents where MAID had been raised inappropriately, with the exception of the 4 incidents already identified. While additional allegations were brought forward through appearances at the Standing Committee on Veteran Affairs, media, and correspondence to the department, VAC was able to thoroughly investigate allegations which included a veteran's full name. No information was found to validate any of these allegations that inappropriate discussions related to MAID had taken place. Based on the review and the analysis of the employees' 2,153 files, a search of all 402,000 files in the VAC's databases, discussions with case managers, veteran service agents and their managers, a review of all incoming communications to the department on this issue, and feedback from staff training and information sessions, VAC has concluded these were 4 incidents completely isolated to a single employee. The employee no longer works for the department. Oh, so I guess it's not a widespread problem then, huh, Danny? Maybe that isn't. Maybe a rogue employee who doesn't have the job that they had before, presumably for the same reasons. Maybe that's not the slam dunk win example that you should be holding up when you're about to try to justify decreasing access to MAID for a large group of people, who are a very small group of people, but it's consequential, who would rightfully, clinically, medically be appropriate to access those services. You're going to hold up this one bad faith actor who was caught as the example of veterans being coached. That's some pretty weak sauce. But unfortunately, the weak sauce doesn't end there, because the other example that Danielle Smith talked about, and again, the way that she started that whole clip, well, you know, the international community is watching what's going on in Alberta. So let me give you two examples that absolutely didn't happen in Alberta. But I said it was, they're watching what's going on in Alberta. So it kind of makes you want to feel like it's happening in Alberta, right? Despite any evidence or the total lack of evidence. That's how I want to feel, because that's how this whole argument works. It's not based on reason. It's not based on logic. It's not based on facts. It's based on making you feel something. Well, there's that young man from Ontario who wasn't able to get MAID in Ontario, and so he flew to BC. And this part sucks. This part of the show sucks, because it's just shitty reporting from a lot of different places. It's really shitty reporting from a lot of different places, including, unfortunately, the Globe and Mail. This is from the Globe and Mail story on January 30th, initially published January 30th, 2026. Ontario woman calls for reform after her son shopped for MAID approval in BC. And if you read that story, the way that the story explains it is that Keanu Mafian received MAID after being denied it by doctors in his home province in recent years. I'm going to throw the quote up from the Globe article. Margaret Marcia said that her 26-year-old son, Keanu Mafian, received MAID after being denied it by doctors in her home province in recent years. She alleges that he shopped around until he could find two physicians needed to approve the procedure. And there's lots of other news outlets that hit the same sort of beat. They hit that same, like, oh, there's this guy from Ontario and he was diabetic, he was blind. None of those are terminal conditions. I mean, if you know anything about fragile type 1 diabetes, you probably wouldn't be saying quite as much. But that's what was presented, and it got picked up and it got run around the block, and everybody thought, oh my God, this is so horrible that this young man who was only blind and diabetic, he had to shop around to get MAID. But unfortunately, according to the Fifth Estate from 4 years ago, there's a whole lot more to this story.
It's hard to imagine it now, but last fall, at the age of 23, Keanu Mafian had a date to die.
Tomorrow, I was planning to wake up quite early, before the sun rose, spend time with my dogs to be the last day with them, the last morning. So my appointment was 9 a.m.
We first met Keanu on the eve of that date. A lifelong diabetic, he'd recently lost sight in one eye. Depressed and in pain from surgery that failed to save his sight, he told us he'd found a doctor who'd agreed to end his life. Then his family found an email.
The letter, I'll never forget what I read. I couldn't believe my mouth open, dropped to the ground. It's like an itinerary.
It was an itinerary, clinical, stark, and that's what Keanu's Uncle Mike found so troubling.
Keanu was to show up at 8:30. Show up at 8:30, come a half an hour early. By 8:45, these are the notes that I was, by 8:45, we'll call in the nurses. 9 o'clock, he gets his needle. 5 minutes after that, remove the dogs. Nice doing business with you. And we jumped into a state of panic, scrambling. My sister just looking at her, my insides just broke.
I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I was obviously upset. I was just furious about the situation. I thought, how on earth did my son get accepted? That's crazy.
But it didn't make it less real. With her son's date for MAID just weeks away, Margaret Marcilla launched into action.
And that's when I started reaching out to everyone that I know. Listen, guys, this is what's happening. My son got approved for euthanasia, and I need everyone's help. I need you guys to post this everywhere. I need you guys to let people know. And that's what everyone did.
Her reach out quickly became a social media campaign. She named the doctor, and within days, more than 10,000 people had signed a petition calling on Ontario's health minister to intervene. It never came to that. Having approved and set a date for Keanu's death twice, the doctor decided to cancel, leaving the family relieved, but like many who heard the story, stunned that a 23-year-old with complications of diabetes had come that close to being helped to die.
Now, from what we've been able to find, there's so many articles about this because it really did become a major national news story, which is why it's so baffling that the Globe and so many other news outlets failed to pick up on the fact that he had, in fact, been approved for MAID in Ontario, scheduled for September 22nd, 2020, or for September 2022. His mom found out. And I'm not criticizing. I want to be real clear about that. I'm not criticizing the mom in any way. That sort of discovery news around your child, I can't even begin to imagine how that would impact a person. I hope I never have to find out. But she launched a social media campaign where she named the physician. And because of the backlash, that physician then canceled the appointment. Now, it's not an isolated incident. And Keanu did talk to a few folks after the fact. One of them blows my mind that I'm going to play this clip next, was a reporter for True North. And I'm not a big fan of playing True North material on the best of days, but he articulates in his own words why he believed that he was having such difficulty getting approval after the fact of that social media campaign.
I've applied in a different country for volunteer assisted death where the laws are more liberal, and although it is not a funded program, it's not financially covered, I did receive an approval for a financial remedy to this procedure. I also wrote about 50 pages of my life story and reasons why I want to die, why I want an assisted death. And I'm very hopeful to attend that organization in Europe.
What country is this, Keanu? Switzerland, okay.
After calling the MAID coordination service here in February, when I was connected with the nurse practitioner who's been in contact on my file for years now, since my first application, she said, your story is on the media, on national television. Everybody in Canada has access to what had happened. It's very unlikely that a doctor is going to assist you now, considering all that your mother has said and done. I felt so defeated when I heard that. And I didn't eat for days. I didn't care for my insulin for days. It was so frustrating to hear that, because in my own country, with the Charter on Rights and Freedoms we have as Canadians, I felt so violated to hear that, and I felt very dejected.
It's complicated and it's nuanced. And it is absolutely not the example that the Premier of Alberta should be holding up as the MAID system failing a person. Keanu did find two physicians in British Columbia who did assess him, and he did receive MAID on in December of 2025. And even the stories that have been told around that have been fragmented, and they've been sensationalistic. There's some versions of the stories that we read that said that the family found out 4 days after the fact when they were contacted by lawyers. But that same True North reporter did a follow-up piece of her own where she said she spoke to the family, and the family said that they knew he was going out there and they knew what he was going out there to do. So it's an incredibly complex and deeply emotionally fraught situation. But for Danielle Smith to use that incredibly complicated and deeply fraught situation and then grossly misrepresent it by claiming that he couldn't get MAID in any the other provinces, so he just went to BC and they hooked him up. That's clearly not the case here. Because as the Fifth Estate demonstrated in 2022, he was approved by 2 physicians for MAID. He had his appointment scheduled, and it was only when the family launched the social media campaign that got as much attention that it did, that it, by some interpretations, forced the doctor to not provide the care. That in and of itself is complex and fraught. And when there's all of these different articles that are running around misrepresenting it, it doesn't take very long of Googling the situation to realize, wow, there's a whole lot more going on here than face value. And with both of these examples that Danielle Smith trotted out, whether it's the Veterans Affairs piece or whether it's this situation. And by the way, just for the record, there are multiple articles that identify multiple other medical conditions that he was experiencing in that interview. He talks about he was suffering from severe glaucoma, which is built up pressure in the eye that's very, 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 very painful. So there's a lot of different things that are going on here. But for the premier to hold these up and misrepresent them, and nobody to go, well, wait a second here, I think there might be a little bit more. That doesn't sound like it makes sense. That sounds egregious. But that's the problem with the Premier of Alberta that we have right now. If she hears a good story, if she hears something that's outlandish, if she hears something that's shocking, she does not seem to have the capacity or the ability to go, oh, I don't know about that. That sounds a little bit... that sounds like I'd like to know more, please. And then she certainly doesn't seem to, nor do her staff or her advisors that surround her seem to feel the need to go, well, maybe there is more to that. Maybe we shouldn't be weaponizing these tragedies and misrepresenting them. Maybe that's not what we should be doing here. Maybe that's not how we should lead a conversation on a subject that is so complex and so emotionally fraught. Maybe that's not what we should be doing here. But that's not what it's about. That's what a reasonable person would presumably want to see done. But that's not what it's about. Because I said at the beginning, we start with this vulnerable group that we need to protect. And in order to protect them, we need to take away rights from a whole bunch of other people. And if that doesn't work, it's okay. We've got a plan B.
Are you prepared to use all the tools in the toolbox, if necessary, to defend this law against legal challenges?
Well, I think we've demonstrated that we are, that we believe, as I mentioned, there's a section of the Charter, Section 1, that allows government to set limits that that are reasonable and that can be justified. And we think that these are reasonable and justified. Sometimes the courts disagree and they offer to strike down our bills, at which point we have the way of engaging with them in conversation by using the notwithstanding clause. So we think that our bill should qualify as reasonable and justified under Section 1, and that's why it's not being introduced with the notwithstanding clause. The courts will do what the courts will do, and I guess we'll see what kind of judgment they make on that. But yes, we do feel strongly enough about it. That's why we're passing the bill. And we just believe that we need to give those with mental illness hope and support so that they develop a love of life again. We don't think that they should be driven down a pathway of despair, and ultimately one that has such finality. So that's the reason why we're passing it, as we fully anticipate that it will be the law in Alberta.
There's so much to unpack there. the idea, though, that if the courts say that we've done a big thing badly, then we can engage in conversation using the notwithstanding clause is a profoundly disingenuous way to present using the notwithstanding clause. We've already seen multiple times how Danielle Smith uses the notwithstanding clause. She gets one of her ministers to write a bill that invokes it, and then she holds her middle finger up to the courts and goes, la, la, la. That's it. In fact, right now, the province of Alberta has sent lawyers to the Supreme Court of Canada to argue that courts shouldn't be even able to rule after the fact. Not that it would change anything, but just to let people know, no, this absolutely was unconstitutional. What just happened here? That was totally a violation of the Charter. Alberta is arguing that judges shouldn't even be able to go that relatively impotent route, because that's how committed they are to engaging in conversation. It's also important to realize that Danielle Smith is not a mental health professional. And while there are many mental illnesses that are recoverable, there are some that are not. And there are some that become so difficult to live with for some people. And that's a conversation that should only be held with that person, the appropriate medical professionals, and anyone that person wants to invite in. It's not a conversation that the Premier of Alberta should just insert herself into. She was asked, Danielle Smith was straight up asked, what do you say to people? And her answer was pretty telling.
What do you say to people with degenerative diseases like Parkinson's or MS who are living with those diseases, who probably are going to die from those diseases, but they don't know, and their doctors don't know if they're going to die in the next 12 months. And so they can't access MAID with the new rules you put in place.
Well, look, once again, it is it's a deeply sensitive and a deeply personal topic to speak about. But we have a framework in place. I think we've used language that has been adopted by our courts in the definition of reasonably foreseeable. That was the initial intent of MAID. That's the framework for MAID. As the Premier mentioned, there are conversations happening all across our country that seek to consider the expansion of MAID to areas that were never intended originally to be so. I think that if it falls within the framework of what the original intention of MAID was, and it complies with Bill 18, then that is a conversation that has to happen between a patient, a doctor, and perhaps family members. It wouldn't be my place to say anything in that regard because it's assessed on a case-by-case basis. But what is important to us is making sure that the frameworks that have been established by the federal and provincial government are fulfilled.
She walked away. She was asked what she would say to the people who are suffering from degenerative conditions that will result in their end of life, maybe not a year from now. What do you say to those people? And the response from the Premier of Alberta was to walk away and let Pinocchio there try to answer the question. And even his answer was laughable. The original intent of MAID? I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. MAID exists in Canada because brave people who were dying decided to spend some of their last energy trying to make things better. Most of the people, the women that I talked about earlier, most of them died before they ever got to see the verdict. The original intent of MAID is not a thing. It is a response by the courts to say, you're doing a big thing badly with your criminal code and you need to fix it. That's it. MAID was not brought about by some high-handed gesture of some legislator who said, hey, you know what? Let's make sure we do this right. Let's make sure. It wasn't that. It was a response to the courts saying, you have shit the bed and you need to fix it. This language of the original intent, this derivative American bullshit that we see the UCP constantly throwing out. Oh, the intent of the founders, the original intent of the founders, the original intent of MAID. It's all nothing. And it doesn't apply to Alberta. It doesn't apply to Canada. It doesn't apply to any of these issues. But they'll roll it out because it sounds good. It makes it sound like there's a point, there was a principle behind this. It makes it sound like it was a good idea. Let's play with some things that have been corrected. That's like saying the original intent of not allowing women to vote. That's like saying the original intent of residential schools. That's like saying the original intent of slavery. If you have something that is patently, demonstrably wrong, and it requires the courts to fix it, the original intent was suppression. The original intent was control. The original intent was oppression. And it's baffling that the Minister of Justice can't seem to wrap his head around those most basic of principles. But again, Smith talked about mental health and how we can just, any mental health condition is recoverable, and she doubled down on it.
What do you think of that body of opinion in our society and in the province who are actually quite comfortable with allowing more people, perhaps even far more people, to kill themselves within the healthcare system? I mean, what do you think? What is your sort of personal thoughts of when you encounter that particular opinion, which is definitely out there?
Well, I would say it goes to what Dr. Coelho has said, is that do people even know that it's being expanded in this way, and the type of people who are seeking to have this kind of service? Because I think when most people think about the MAID debate, they think back to Sue Rodriguez and her Huntington's disease. And I think when people look at that circumstance, that's why you end up with widespread support for the concept for those whose death is reasonably foreseeable and who are of sound mind and able to make their own judgment. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who are depressed, people who have PTSD, people who are isolated and lonely and in poverty and maybe marginalized. And I think if we put a different frame on that, it's not a matter of whether a person might make that decision personally if it was happening to them. It's, do we have an obligation to make sure the most vulnerable in society are not going down a pathway when they see no other options? Our job as government, and I think as a society, is to give people other options. So I would just hope that people would frame it. People are pretty compassionate, and we have an inclusive approach in how we deal with those with disabilities. We're debating that in the legislature. We debate it in our schools. It seems to me that in this circumstance, we should take that same lens, is that we want to make sure that we're supporting people when they're at their lowest points, especially if there's a very reasonable likelihood of recovery.
Everything that she lists off there are transient mental health conditions or transient social conditions. There is a lot of truth to be said that you tend to see, and the evidence bears this out, you tend to see higher incidences of health problems in, and more severe outcomes in, lower socioeconomic stratifications. That's just the reality. It's a little bonkers to me that this premier talks about things in the way that she does. And a reporter did follow up with exactly the question that needed to be asked.
Instead of limiting MAID, why not take the approach of significantly investing in mental health supports, in senior supports, palliative care, increasing minimum wage, kind of the root causes of a lot of the things you guys have been bringing up?
Well, we do invest in all of those things. One of the approaches that we're taking in encouraging those with disabilities to work to the full extent of their ability is exactly for that. We've also coupled that with $185 million to help ensure that those who have limitations in being able to work full-time have that first opportunity of a job. We have our recovery communities and our therapeutic living units and corrections facilities so that we can connect people to recovery programs and then ultimately get them on a pathway to get that first job, because you want people to have a social circle. You want them to have a network. You want them to have someone to call other than a lawyer or a doctor. These are all foundational to the approach that we're taking, is we want to end the social isolation that might be leading to some of this. So I would say that our holistic approach is one focused on recovery. It's why we've invested an historic amount in mental health and addiction, $2 billion this year. We're building 11 recovery communities. We're building additional supports for CASA mental health and a mental health framework. These are all part and parcel of our firm belief that recovery is possible. And that's why we want to lead with that foot rather than leading with something so final.
And again, we come back to the problem of, for transient mental health stuffs, recovery is possible. And there's a lot of mental health conditions that are absolutely manageable through a variety of different treatment modalities. I'm taking nothing away from that. But there's some that just aren't. And again, that's a conversation that should be occurring between the person who's living that experience, their healthcare team, and anybody else that they decide to include in that conversation. And it's no business of the premiers to throw down these subjective moral imperatives on people that do not align with the current direction that the courts are supporting. It's just not. And I'm going to be honest with you, to hear Danielle Smith say the recovery piece is just, that's not the answer to everything, Danny. There's other complex, nuanced answers that you can throw out. It doesn't have to be recovery every single time. But the idea that Danielle Smith and the UCP are supporting the vulnerable and the disabled, I'm sorry, this is the same government that is clawing back $200 a month. The UCP is literally making millions of dollars every month on the backs of disabled people in this province. They could have kept AISH at what they were keeping AISH, but instead, when the federal government stepped up and said, you know what, we need to get people above the poverty line, or at least slightly less below it, the province didn't respond by saying, cool, that's good. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, and these folks can keep that extra 200. Instead, what they did was they built a massive bureaucratic infrastructure to make sure that they could claw back that $200 a month from every person on AISH, ADAP going forward. That's what this government and this province chose to do. This government just recently, last week, voted down Bill 201, the Accessible Alberta Act, which was designed to make places more accessible for disabled people. That's it. That's all it was. There was no poison pill. There was no and also everybody gets free Cadbury Easter eggs this next week. There was none of that. It was literally, let's find ways to make sure that disabled Albertans are able to access the spaces that everybody else can access so they can be part of that social fabric that Danny says the UCP is so desperately trying to support. This is the same government trying to protect vulnerable people while they punch down on some of the most vulnerable youth that there are, against all available evidence. Danielle Smith's anti-trans policies go against medical evidence. They're built on the same bullshit and misdirection that she's using here on MAID, and they have caused real harm. We had a guest on this show a couple of years ago when Danny first rolled out her anti-trans policies. That guest had a family member who ended up dying from suicide because of Danielle Smith's policies. Clearly articulated. That's just the reality. And so when Danielle Smith talks about her desire to protect the vulnerable and to build a stronger social fabric, it is lip service. She is using all of the words, and there's absolutely nothing behind them. We have been getting DMs all week about a number of different social programs that have been defunded. We got one just yesterday about the Healing Lodge here in Calgary. They had their funding cut. They're having to cut programs. These are programs that are amazing, but they're not ideologically aligned. Damn the evidence. They're not ideologically aligned, and for that reason, they have to go. And you might be thinking, well, but, that was when they first launched the bill. Maybe she changed her position. Maybe she evolved. Maybe she's not going to bullshit spin quite as much, which brings us to your province, your premier, yesterday.
Good morning, Premier Smith. I'd like to speak to you about Bill 18. This bill that you're proposing is going to deny advance requests, all the advance requests for MAID, medical assistance in dying. Are you aware that thousands of Albertans are being diagnosed every day with diseases that will gradually rob them of their mental and physical abilities to function? These individuals and their families need the hope and the comfort that an advance request would provide them. Without the ability to put advance requests in place, these people will be sentenced to a life of intolerable suffering. They may live for years where they will depend on institutional care for their basic needs, placing emotional and financial stress on them and their families. There are already safeguards in place to ensure MAID is used in hopeless cases. Why would you deny advance requests that would provide clear criteria set forth by patients, their families, and in consultation with their healthcare practitioners and MAID practitioners? I would ask your government to please consider amending this bill to make concessions for advance requests for individuals and families that are facing these challenges. Would you please make a commitment to the thousands of Albertans and their families that need this hope of a dignified death, the opportunity to make advance requests while they have the capacity to clearly set out their criteria for end-of-life care?
Well, thanks, Linda. I should mention that this is federal law. The federal law defines what criminal code sanctions are for this type of action, and the federal law does not allow advance requests. So our law just replicates what the federal law already says. The federal law also doesn't allow for under 18 to take MAID, and that's also in our law. So those are two things that are in parallel to what we see federally. The only difference that we made is that there has been a court decision saying that somebody for whom mental health is their only condition should be allowed to seek MAID. And we just don't think depressed people and those with PTSD should be told your only solution is to kill yourself. We think they should be told that there is hope and we can see recovery. Now, Quebec has gone in a different direction. Quebec is, I think, challenging the federal criminal code framework, and they're allowing advance requests. I don't know if the federal government will do anything about that, but it does seem to me that there is a broader conversation that has to take place on that. And we don't want to go further than what the federal law allows, but we think that the court decision, especially since we've seen that there have been instances where people who have PTSD have been suggested for MAID by Veterans Affairs officials. We think that's outrageous. We have seen instances where a young man couldn't get MAID in Ontario and flew to BC and did, which we think is outrageous. We think we should be giving people hope. So I think there's probably still an open societal debate to have about advance requests. I'd encourage you to contact your MP and maybe lobby at the federal level. But we're not going to go any further than the federal law. And what we put in there was to codify a couple of things that are already in federal law, but also to say that we're just not going to go that extra step on mental health.
The bullshit is remarkable. The bullshit is so remarkable. It's federal law. We're just replicating the federal law because we're all about red tape. The dissonance. I don't understand. I honestly don't understand how people don't experience dissonance when they're able to say this stuff. Danielle Smith, the leader of the party that's all against red tape, is replicating the federal law for no good reason, and we're supposed to just accept that. We're supposed to just believe that. No, that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is the federal government has clearly signaled that they will be making some sort of a program to allow for advanced requests, and Danny's going to get ahead of it right now, because she's got religious zealots in her caucus who absolutely believe that this is an affront to God. It has nothing to do with evidence. It has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with, I'm going to put my religious beliefs on everybody else. And Danielle Smith is just going along with it because she wants to keep her caucus together. And that's it. She is indifferent to the suffering that she's going to force people to experience, because she's doing what's politically expedient for her. And that's it. And the comments, well, we don't believe that it's appropriate to tell people that your only solution is to kill yourself. Do I have to go back to the slides that detail all of the steps that go through how all of the other available treatment modalities have to be explained? All of the other options have to be presented before somebody can access MAID. But again, it's not about reality. It's not about facts. It's about telling a good story, because Danny loves her good stories. And that's it. And that's what people need to realize. That's what people really need to internalize and find ways to communicate to the people in their lives. I hear there's a holiday coming up. Hey, you know what? You know what's a great topic around Easter dinner? Bring up MAID. Bring up MAID at Easter dinner and just say, hey, you know what? I'm okay if we have different opinions. I just think that those opinions should be based on things that are actually happening and not the bedtime stories that Danny tries to tell people. If you want to believe that if you're somebody who I would never, ever access MAID, that's cool for you, man. I got no problem with that. I don't believe anybody should be forced to access MAID. I also don't believe anybody should be forced to not have that as an available option under the right circumstances with the right safeguards. That's it. Why are we so afraid of having that adult conversation? Because here's the reality. Danny has said, well, you know, it's these veterans. It was one wayward employee who was breaking the rules. It was fully investigated. It was an isolated incident. It's a nothing burger. Well, yeah, but there's that guy from Ontario. Again, grossly misrepresenting a family tragedy for your own political weaponization. And it's not that he couldn't access MAID in Ontario. It's that he did, and his family launched a social media bomb that he believed prevented him from accessing it again. That's what it is. Are we going to make policy on that? Is that what we're doing now? I'm starting to think the solution to Alberta's problems is somebody needs to start telling Danielle Smith progressively scary bedtime stories. Danny, did you hear the story about the kid who was suffering from gender dysphoria, which is the pain that comes from not being able to access appropriate gender affirming care, and because of all of that pain, he tried to access MAID. He did. He got it. He got it too. He flew to Uzbekistan, and they did it there with camels. It was horrifying, Danny. You have to do something. You have to make the gender affirming care accessible, so we don't have kids flying to Uzbekistan and getting MAID via camel. Do it, Danny. Do it, please. I was going to do a funny show tonight. I had jokes, I had plans, and then I got into the fact checking, and it just turned into a dirge. I apologize for that. Next week, we're going to have hopefully a little bit more fun. I'm going to start writing the jokes as soon as I get off of the show so that we have some better jokes, because that was just that was not a fun episode. That was not. But that's where we are. And if we don't call out the bullshit, then we are where we are. Make dinner times uncomfortable. Like, seriously, if you are somebody who has the privilege of being able to go to a family meal, I don't think there's anything wrong with, like mid potatoes or whatever. Ham, is that it? I'm vegetarian, so I don't do the full spread. But like, let's say ham, Easter ham. That sounds like a thing. I remember that. There's nothing wrong with mid ham just being like, hey, did you see the bullshit that our premier said about MAID? Why do you think she's lying to people? Just drop that hand grenade into the middle of the ham and see what happens. I think that would be good fun. Good way to start some conversations. I'm going to do the plugs, and then I'm going to enjoy my clip. Because damn it, she doesn't get to take that away from me. If you have appreciated the show tonight, if you haven't, I don't blame you. I don't blame you in the slightest. If you are walking back from tonight's show and like, the fuck was that? I don't blame you at all. But if you do appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, you can sign up to be one of our Patreon supporters at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. You can choose your monthly support lever thinger. That is very helpful to us if you do that. So that's one choice. But if you're not a fan of the long-term commitment, then you can also always send an e-transfer to info@thebreakdownab.ca. All that goes to the general pool of keeping the lights on and the cameras working and all of those things. That's what I got. I got a couple other things I want to plug real quick because I think they're going to be a lot of fun. We're hopefully going to be recording an episode on the electoral boundaries with none other than Dr. Dwayne Bratt. He is strictly forbidden. It is not to go 2 hours long. I have told him I will do my best. But we're going to talk about the electoral boundaries. Hopefully he's going to have a chance to take a look at everything that I ranted about tonight and tell me everything that I got wrong, which I'm hoping is all of it. I'm hoping that he comes back and is like, wow, Nate, you got so much wrong. Let me tell you how everything's going to be okay. That's what I'm hoping for. Fingers crossed. We also have, we're almost done. It's been a bit of a year for those who follow the exploits of myself and The Breakdown. It's been a bit of a year. And so we've had a couple of long-standing projects that have been sort of slow cooking. And they're just about done. And I'm very excited for the episode on harm reduction and East Hastings that we're going to be bringing to you from in the past East Hastings, because we did a walk along with none other than the incomparable Mr. Guy Felicella, and we are just about done editing that audio. That'll go up as a standalone audio episode, because I didn't bring a camera because I don't believe in filming people who are dealing with those sorts of things without their permission. And that's a lot of paperwork to try to collect. So it's audio only, but look for that. That'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Yep, that's what I got. And in order to cheer myself up and remind all of us that our premier is, you can't say that she's an idiot. She just behaves like one. In order to remind myself of that, here it is.
How's your BS detector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
The second nod, I was hoping, I was scared. I'm not going to lie. I was scared to play that tonight because I was like, my God, what if it doesn't land? What if I don't feel that same sense of joy at just how dumb she's being? And the second nod, what if that's gone? What if she's taken that from me with this utter bullshit parade that she put on this week on MAID? What if that's happened? No, it's still funny as all hell. So I'm good. Thank you, everybody who tuned in tonight. Thank you to the chat. It was a very, very active chat tonight. Love seeing that. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, please do the stars and the comments and the ratings and all of those things. If you're watching on the YouTubes, if you're watching it live right now, make sure that you like and subscribe. And if you're watching it after, make sure that you like and subscribe. And here's the thing, we started doing this new thing. I'm told the 2-hour dirges are a little bit much. And so we've started putting up the segments separately. So if you have somebody in your life that you want to hit with the MAID thing, that'll probably be going up on I imagine Tuesday or Thursday. And you can just send that to them. You can just send them the link. You can send that link to all of your friends and family and be like, hey, we need to have a talk because there's some bullshit going on here. So look for that. And if you like and subscribe with the little bell thing, whenever we post one of those, you'll get the notifications. So there's my rant. Thank you all so much. We will be back next week for another live episode. And in the meantime, in between time, keep the conversation going.